What is up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of 10-Minute Poker Tips. We got a special guest today. His name is Ian Chan. He is a software engineer by trade, by day. In the evenings and on the weekends, he moonlights as a recreational poker player, but he plays at the level of professional. This guy just finished second in the triple draw mix at WSOP, missing his first bracelet by that much. It hurts.
Yeah,
but
stuff stinks.
but what Ian's going to be talking about it today is he actually has developed a solver for mixed game. Really want to get into that because this is something that I think doesn't exist anywhere today.
Yeah, awesome to be here. Thanks for having me, and excited to talk about this topic, especially because, we recently just had the 100K mixed event at PokerGo. Was really exciting in the mixed community, like some high-level commentary, high-level play. But the game is obviously now being played at the highest levels. So I figured it's about time we start doing hand history analysis and hand breakdowns at the highest level. So that's what I'll be diving into today. So
Nice.
Really wanted to, talk about like the wild, wild west of solvers and mixed games, because you're right, there's not a lot out there. I'm going to start off by just going right into a hand history from the most recent LAPC 2025. In the triple draw mix, that's the game that I play the most. It's a mix of Badugi, ace to five, and deuce to seven. And the hand that I'll be reviewing is the ace to five hand. So if you've never heard of this game, ace to five triple draw, aka California low ball, it's a 5-card draw game, 3 rounds of draws, 4 rounds of betting. The goal is to get the worst hand possible, where straights and flushes don't matter, pairs are bad. So the wheel, 5, 4, 3, 2, ace is the nuts. And the villain in this hand is a WSOP bracelet winner, very capable mixed pro. So let's dive right into it. So the hand starts with it folding to be in the button. I opened 5-3 deuce, which is a draw 3 hand, or draw 2 hand, sorry. And the big blind defends. He D1s, so he draws 1, I draw 2, and then he bets and I call. So that's like a pretty standard. I was surprised that he drew 1 because he didn't 3-bet me pre, but that's fine. He drew 1 again. I drew 2 again. Goes bet call. Again, pretty standard line. On the last draw, he draws 1. I draw 1. And then he flicks in a dark bet. And then we make a jack. So this is a pretty interesting spot that I'm going to spend most of this time talking through. So yes, this is a spot that every mixed player will find themselves in a lot. I picked this particular hand because I think for the no limit players that don't know mixed games, this is a very easy concept to understand. They took 1 card. I took 1 card. Whoever picks or whoever draws the lowest card is basically going to win the pot. There's 5.25 big bets in the pot. The villain decided to bet blind. So the question is, what do we do? And Derek, I know you don't play mixed, but I'm curious, what do you do here and why?
It feels like the jack is too, the thing is, I don't know. If I knew, then I would probably know what the average strength hand would be in the situation. I know from my super amateur outsider perspective, a jack feels too high to be a winner here. But what was the bet into the pot?
So because we're playing fixed limit, the pot was five big bets, and then he bet 1 big bet. So he's basically betting 1 unit. Yeah.
It's so hard to be getting those type of pot odds, but I do feel like in these games, you have to find those folds sometimes. And I think this might be one of those spots where I folded. I just can't get married to the ace, deuce, 3, 5 and realize that the jack feels high. That's just my amateur perspective.
No, it's a great justification. So we'll dive into what some of the conventional wisdom is here. So this D1 river is one of the most common spots in all the triple draw games. So conventional wisdom says ranges do matter. We didn't talk too much about the ranges or range construction here, but in ace to 5 in particular, equities run so close that it's basically a flip. We're going into this river and he's betting dark and we're basically flipping on equity. Jack low or a made jack actually is right in the middle. So that's the average hand here. And, given that the pot is, we're getting 6 to 1, we need about 5% of our range. So if a jack is the average hand, we're way ahead in our range right now. So conventional wisdom says it's okay to call here. In game, we looked at our jack and just snapped it off. And then the villain peeked and peeled his card. He sees a king and then he muffed. Maybe when I'm playing you in a mixed game, I'll make sure I throw in this bet here on the river at 100%. I think that most mixed players will see this hand, and this would be pretty standard hand for them, and they would hopefully find this call because this is going to come up a lot. What I wanted to do was really figure out, what does the solver do here? And this is the exact spot, not from this tournament, but in general, is when I got really interested in solvers. I was playing mixed cash game for years, and draw games were my favorite by far. I constantly found myself in these draw one situations in all of the games. And I always felt like I was guessing. And I also observed that a lot of the pros, they were confidently making decisions that I felt like were probably wrong, but nobody really had an answer. There's no real literature on this. There's no GTO wizard for solvers. So I spent well over a year building a solver to find out what the answer is. And that's what I'm going to, dig into right now. And of course, on Poker AI, I had to use AI and generate some nice imagery for us as well. Of course. Great. So we did it. We spent like a year building a solver, and I'm going to walk through what the results of this solver look like. So this is a snapshot of a GTO strategy for this particular game in this particular spot. On the left here is an enumeration of every hand combination that the player can arrive at the river after D1 with. In the middle, and of course I borrowed some aesthetics from some familiar tools, is the strategy that the solver is recommending. So for instance, as you'd expect with the nuts, with the wheel, 100% raise, and that goes down to a 7 when we're starting to find just flats or just calls. And then over here, we see the frequency that we're arriving with this hand and the cumulative distribution of how much of our range does this represent. This is just a snapshot. This is like a, work in progress. This is some experimental stuff that I'm using. But when we look at the actual hand and take a step back, for this spot, I ran a simmed 19 billion hands, which is probably more mixed hands than any human could ever play to get the answer. Right. And I got this solution to this 125-year-old game. This is the Nash equilibrium for the D1 spot. And this is a spot that I've studied a lot. So when I was in the spot live in game, I knew exactly where I was. I knew exactly what I was calling with, raising with, folding with, bluffing with. I felt a lot more comfortable navigating a hand against a WSOP bracelet winner that normally I'd be like very intimidated to be up against.
And maybe you're going to get into this, but how are you doing any sort of validation? That's probably the biggest thing. Anybody who even came up with Pio Solver or GTO Wizard, they had to basically validate the results.
Yeah, a lot of it was first sanity checking that it wasn't doing anything that just was clearly like a negative EV play, because it all boils down to maximizing EV or really minimizing loss. Yeah. So
a sanity check is just like an eye test, right?
An eye test gets pretty far because any mixed player would look at this visual here and know exactly what it's trying to do and would visually see that this makes sense. Yeah. Another test that I was doing was looking at what's the frequency of my bluffs here versus the frequency of my value call/raises, and making sure that that ratio isn't creating odds that the villain can call with anything. Because if it's doing that, it means it's just bluffing way more than baseline.
Got it.
So this was the strategy that the solver was recommending. We can see my jack high here is right in the middle. So it was a slam dunk, 100% call.
Yep, that's the average hand, just like you said.
Exactly, yeah. So we can also use the solver to analyze, well, how did the villain play and what are some things that I can learn from that? And this is what I've been doing off the felt quite a lot of studying spots. The villain's line at GTO would be betting about 40% and checking 60%, even though he bet dark. And a question I've always been wondering is like, well, is betting dark or checking dark really bad? Is this really far from GTO? I ran 4 different sims, node locking the villain strategy. And I set up a sim where they dark check, where they randomize, where they bet dark, like what happened in game, and when they nut pedal and they only lead out with the nuts. And we can see how far each one of these strategies drifts from the GTO baseline. We can see the dark bet line is actually losing about 13 big bets per 100.
Well, it's not the worst, actually. Nut pedaling is the worst, yeah.
And this surprised me the most. And I think a lot of the population nut pedals, and they're only going to lead out with the nuts, but that's like super exploitable because that means that the in-position player can just fold.
It's so interesting because like literally this insight is stuff that Hold'em players learned 5 years ago, 6 years ago, right? And it just feels like mixed games is catching up, but it's so interesting that basically the game still, it's the same, right? You have so many players who almost anecdotally are telling you, well, I would only ever bet this here, but then it's just like, I don't even want to correct you here, but if you just do that, you're never going to get called and you're actually probably losing money in the long run. And here it is statistically.
Exactly. Yeah. And we don't need to get into the whole exploitative versus GTO debate because that's like more than a 10-minute poker tip, but
you can come back on, buddy, and do a second one.
For sure. Yeah. But yeah, it was great to get some data behind these anecdotes because as you said, it's been 125 years of people anecdotally playing some of these mixed games that are only now being played at like that highest stage.
Right.
Some takeaways, because we can't just like stare at charts and memorize them and then play. The first tip is just seeing these solutions, adjusting our defend line in this spot, the D1 in position spot. And it's really a function of how big the pot is. If the pot's tiny, a limped pot that gets checked all the way to the river, we really don't need to defend a lot. So we should be folding more. And this solution is folding, I probably can't see it, but about 40%. Here's the baseline example where it was about 5 big bets and it's only folding about 16%. And then, I took a ridiculous exaggerated example where they cap every street or they're just doing a raising war where we're barely folding, and it's only folding about 6%. So the first tip is just, find that line, adjust it to the pot size, and you should be pretty close to the baseline.
Nice.
The second one is, and this is the one that makes most mixed players pretty uncomfortable, is like we should be defending a lot more than we probably are. The solver, by definition, is calling at around the minimum defense frequency because it's playing like perfect game theoretically optimal poker. So the MDF in this hand was about 84%. And if we look at the distribution of a range, this is when it really starts to find some folds. Pair of twos in this particular case, we should be actually calling a lot more. And I know your original intuition was Jack is a little weak. It's not a super strong hand, but as we find here, it's actually within our defense range.
Have you found the solver doing tricky things like taking a snow with like a deuce?
Definitely. Yeah. Solver does some what at first might seem like crazy things, but then when you think about it and you break it down, it makes sense.
So interesting.
And I'll talk about that in, I think, the fourth tip too.
Okay.
The third tip is probably shouldn't be betting dark. This is not super common in Hold'em anymore, but this is actually very common in the mixed streets. People bet dark and people check dark so much still. Okay. And it's just this automatic play. And as we looked at this data, it suggests drifts pretty far from baseline to the point where in this particular instance, just randomizing was a closer approximation than betting dark. If you must, I would say randomize, but otherwise don't obviously bet dark because somebody that's studied the solvers, I can actually exploit that pretty heavily. And then the last tip, and this goes back to what you were asking, I would suggest spending as much time as possible finding where these baselines are and studying these common river spots way before worrying about getting fancy and finding creative snows and worrying about blockers, worrying about discards. These are all very important things. But if you're off baseline, then you're just torching and hemorrhaging EV. Even if you find that really awesome quad 2 snow, it doesn't really matter too much.
It's the same thing with Hold'em too. We try to teach people who are new, plug your pre-flop leaks first before you start getting into all the fancy stuff. It comes up so less frequently than the basic stuff. You really should fix your baseline.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, that was a deep dive into the solver world, or at least a quick glimpse into some of the crazy in the lab experiments I've been doing over the last little while.
That's amazing, and especially how much it mirrors like Hold'em solvers. Is this something that what are you trying to do with this? Like, are you trying to get it out to the public and people access this and play around with it?
Yeah, I think, and I talked to a lot of folks in the mixed community about this that are hesitant to be excited about something like this. But as I told them, solvers are a thing. Solutions to these games is real. It's just a matter of time. My plan is to just keep exploring and learning. I did this for the pursuit of intellectual and academic curiosity. If you're interested in learning more, like message me on Twitter. I'm just Chanian on Twitter. I've been very vocal and very public about the research I've been doing, and I'm happy to chat with you about it. And I'll be in the WSOP this summer, so if you want to come by and buy me a coffee, I'd be happy to pull up my laptop and show you some cool stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely reach out to Ian on Twitter if you want to ask some questions about the solver. But I do think that you're correct that solvers are inevitable in poker, and then just being against them is a little bit being a Luddite in technology. It's coming whether you like it or not.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thanks for coming on, buddy. This was amazing. So excited to see this advance in technology, even in mixed games. And I hope you come back on the show again and talk a little bit more about it as you advance.
Absolutely. Thanks, Derek.